Welcome, friends. Let's get started.
All right. Hi, everyone. Thank you all for being here today. We just want to thank you for taking your time and registering and sharing this space with us for our Ethnographer Extravaganza Series for spring 2023. This is our last part of our series today with our guest speaker, Kimberly Dark. Before we get into today's speaker, I'm going to do a land acknowledgement. So I just want to take a moment to reflect on the lands which we reside on. So we come from many places and we want to acknowledge the ancestral homelands and the traditional territories of the indigenous peoples who have been here. San Diego Mesa College is built on the ancestral homelands of the Kumeyaay people. We acknowledge and honor their tremendous contributions to our region and thank them for their stewardship, past, present, and future. We also want to honor the legacy of the African diaspora, Black life, and the free enslaved labor which this country was built upon. We acknowledge, protect, and uplift the humanity of our Indigenous and Black sisters and brothers. With this acknowledgement, we want to give an honor through our work and continue to stand up for racial and social justice. Thank you, everyone. And now back to Professor Wendy Smith.
Thank you, Andrew. My name is Wendy Smith, and I'm a facilitator for today's event, which is being recorded to share with those of you who are unable to attend. Please fill out our survey. The link is in the chat. This helps us learn more about our audience and improve what we do. I teach English composition courses with the theme of ethnography and ethnographic writing. I think it's more important than ever that students immerse themselves in communities, both familiar and unfamiliar. Qualitative research is relevant to life, career, prioritizing lived experience, observational powers, and diverse perspectives. And students bring so much to the table. I always learn from them. Thank you, students who are here. Today, we're excited to present the multi-talented Kimberly Dark, author of several books of essays and poetry, including Damaged Like Me and Fat, Pretty, and Soon to Be Old. Her ability to make the personal political is grounded in her training as a sociologist, and you can find her course offerings in sociology at CalState San Marcos. Right now, she's teaching sociology of education, and later this summer, she'll be teaching at CalState Summer Arts. Shall we get started?
Now I'm muted. Now I'm unmuted. So hey, that's great. Thank you so much, Wendy, for inviting me to do this, and thanks to all of you who are, working to put on this series of talks. It's a great thing. I agree with Wendy that it's time to build our skills in listening and understanding one another. And that really is what ethnography is all about. I mean, think about the word, right? Ethnography, that we are writing about culture. And that's a powerfully important thing to do in a time when things are so divisive, and especially immigrants are misunderstood in our nation, and various groups are considered less than. They live on the margins, and a lot of times this is what social research does. Qualitative research and ethnography in particular is to help us know more than we would just by looking at numeric data. So one of the things I was asked to do is to talk about how I came to ethnography, and sort of the career path that took, and also how ethnography shows up in the world. So I'm going to comment on those things, and then hopefully, I'll get some more guidance after that. So listen, I'm a sociologist by training. I have a master's degree, and I started out with a bachelor's in sociology, and not like a big plan for a career. I don't know if some of you maybe have that same situation, but bachelor's in sociology is like, right, I can get a job. And so I did. I worked in human services and education. And at some point I thought, well, I'll get this master's degree too. This sounds like fun. At that point, I was hired to do some needs assessment for a community on the border in San Diego County, like Imperial Beach, Nestor, San Ysidro, all those little border communities. And this needs assessment was going to lead us toward not just what kind of services do people need, like, oh, I need some medical services, or I need to not drive all the way to downtown San Diego to get my food stamps benefits, or whatever the thing was. Not just that, but what is keeping people from accessing the services that their families need? What kind of service delivery is helpful? So check it out. This is the deal with quantitative and qualitative data. They're both useful, but we are sort of addicted to quantitative data in the US, and it does not serve everything. It's like thinking you can get by eating only bread. You need other stuff. You need, you need to find the vegetables too. So quantitative data is really good for finding superficial, broad information. And we need broad information because there's no way that you could go out and observe or interact with, or even give a, interview to like millions of people. So we absolutely need broad, superficial data, but we also need deep dive data. And so that's kind of how you can think about that, is like the qualitative data is the deeper hole, the deeper understanding of not just what's happening, but how is it happening and what does it mean to people. So that's what we're doing when we go out and observe and do interviews and do focus groups. All of these are types of qualitative data. So I had started doing that in these communities even while I was getting that master's degree, but definitely that degree for me, especially because I was doing that work, focused on qualitative research. And I spent a few years doing that work with the South Bay Union School District. And then little by little, because, we had some success, I also wrote some grants. We did some work to build school linked services in that region. But little by little, people started to ask me, okay, well, how did you do that assessment? And pretty soon I felt like I was coaching people to do the thing that we did, which was great, except for when it turns into like another full-time job that you're coaching other people on how to do what you did. So there was a logical step there for me to becoming a consultant. And as a consultant, I worked with folks on how to do assessment and needs assessment themselves, but also they could hire us to do it. And us being me plus the researchers and research assistants that eventually I worked with. So, we were a small firm, and the firm was called Current Change Consulting. And we worked with school districts and nonprofits and foundations, funders. We worked with these kinds of groups to find stuff out about, people living in local communities. So it might be a school that wants to find out, like, why can't we get more parent involvement? Or it might be a health organization that wants to find out, wow, why are we seeing such bad dental care among, elementary school students? Like, how do we provide better dental care for this population? So all kinds of different things related to health and human service delivery. Current Change was a small firm, and I think at our largest, it was me, 3 researchers, 3 research assistants, a grant writer, and an admin. And, the size of our group kind of varied over the years. And that was the work that I did full time for 11 years. I still consider myself a social researcher, even though the primary thing I do nowadays is, well, I still teach some sociology, but I write books, and I primarily write books about my own life. We call that memoir, right? So sometimes the books I write are called memoir, but in the social science world, they are also sometimes called autoethnography. So think about that word for a minute, right? You've got ethnography, writing about the culture, and then auto in front of it means that I am writing about myself in order to understand the culture. And so some of my books and articles are used in sociology classes because they do exactly this thing. They offer a an intimate perspective. For instance, the book I wrote, Fat, Pretty, and Soon to Be Old, that would be me. Those are things that are describing me. And one of the themes that I write about is appearance and identity privilege. And so, sure, I can write about appearance and identity privilege, and I can talk about race and size and disability and age. I can talk about those things without ever talking about myself. But there's a whole different perspective if I am telling you personal stories that illuminate the sociological concepts that I want us to discuss. So that's sort of the quick journey, right, from needs assessment while I'm getting my master's degree to doing consulting as a qualitative researcher, which involved a lot of ethnography, and then now doing primarily autoethnography as a researcher and still as a sociologist. So I'm going to just keep talking, by the way. And, if there are questions, you can, I guess, put them, do they put them in the chat? What do they do with their questions?
The chat works just fine.
Okay.
And
So
I'll let you know if something pops up.
perfect. And,
Okay.
and otherwise, I'll just keep talking for a little while. And so listen, I wanted to say something about how is a research project born, right? Because I mentioned that this was a school district that hired me to do that needs assessment because they had the idea of writing grants to get some more money to fill those needs. So sometimes an assessment is born from that, right? We want to find out what's happening. And usually it's yeah, okay, people are trying to get parent involvement at school, for instance, but it's not working. So we need to find out more. We need the deeper dive. So this is often why people engage with qualitative methods rather than quantitative methods. I would like to say, though, as somebody who did research as a consultant for a long time, even when people think they only want quantitative methods, it isn't true. They actually need some qualitative work and they don't know it yet. And that's because of that, as I mentioned, we're kind of addicted to numbers as a culture, as if somehow we can describe everything just with numbers. So, my first task, anytime someone would come to me and say, right, we want to do some community assessment, or we want to answer this research question, my first task was always to take a look at what they want and decide which methods were the best ones. So this is tricky because sometimes, it's like I'm just going to stick with that parent involvement at school topic because it's an easy one to talk about. But so let's say they're saying, right, well, we have loads of parents and they drop their kids off, but then they don't come. And even if we invite them, they don't come. And even if we have the meeting at different times, they don't come. And so oftentimes it's like that. And obviously, well, I think it's obvious. You can't find out the answer to that question by giving those same parents a survey because they don't want to come. They don't want to fill out that survey. They don't want to do it. Somebody has to pay attention to what they actually are thinking and feeling about the school, about being asked for stuff at school, about services, or like what's available to them or what's not. And that is going to take some talking and listening. And talking and listening is the basis of qualitative research. The other basis, if we think of this like a three-legged stool, there's the talking, the listening, and the writing, because the qualitative researcher's job is to write the data that then we go through and look for themes in. So you can't write the data without listening. You can't write the data without having some interactions. But if you write without listening, you're screwed. If you just listen but don't write, you're screwed, right? Like, so this really has to be a process of engagement in a meaningful way. And there's different ways to engage in qualitative research, right? There's just observation, right? Sometimes you can learn a lot just by observing people. There's also participant observation, where like maybe I go and I take a role helping to hand out the school breakfasts. And I'm a participant while parents are dropping off their kids, and I'm interacting with them in that way. That's participant observation. Could also be interviews or focus groups. But probably not that first, right? Otherwise, you would have already gotten the engagement that you want. So this is one way that people sort of come upon doing qualitative research, doing ethnography, is because they want to write a grant. They want to accomplish a thing, right? And they're out trying to find out, okay, what does our community need? And here's something important. When you come up with a research question like, how do people need to be approached in order to get involved at school? That, my friends, is an inductive research question. It means, it probably has the word how in it, right? How does this happen? And I'm not assuming I know the answer. I am developing a broad category of interest, right? Participation in your child's school is the broad category of interest. But I'm pretty much saying, yeah, how does this happen? Because I don't know. Which is very different than, if we serve food at meetings, will parents come? That's a deductive research question. And sometimes people, without knowing it, like just unconsciously, already think they know what's what before they start research. And that's troublesome with ethnography. So the inductive approach, like coming up with an open-ended question that you want to explore, and you are open to finding out new things, like, oh my gosh, it's because everybody in this community works for a factory that, I don't know, they're always at work when you want them to come to school. Like, that might be a thing nobody figured out yet. I mean, it's usually more, subtle than that. But yeah, so that is what, one way. Here's another way that people come to an ethnography, is because a funder, not a service provider, right? Like a school is a service provider, a clinic is a service provider. Sometimes it is a funder that says, hey, we want to find out what is happening. We're giving some money in this community, and we want to find out what is happening with needs that are unmet, but also we want to find out what these current services, what good are they doing? So one of those is assessment research, the other is evaluation research. And so sometimes a funder wants to know all of that stuff, and we have to, put together the parameters of that research. So that, because you can't just go out and go like, hey, what's happening? It needs to be a little more specific than that, but not so specific that you are forgetting to be open to surprise.
Kimberly,
Yes.
it looks like we have a question in the chat from Natalia Gomez. What is an example of a qualitative question you've come across that can't be answered by a survey? And the second one was, do you get most of your qualitative research at schools?
Well, let me answer the second one first, because that one's easier. For my research consulting firm, most of our clients were schools, nonprofits, and foundations. And so it was from a variety of, of those folks. But there are definitely research firms that work with companies, for-profit companies that work with government. That just wasn't my thing. So yes, a lot of my clients were schools, but not all of them. So what is an example of a qualitative question that can't be answered by a survey? I mean, I think I've already given you an example of one. you can't answer the question, why are you not coming to school meetings, using a survey, because somebody who does not want to show up to a meeting also does not want your survey, right? You can't answer questions about often you can't answer questions about what causes people guilt or shame using a survey. Deep feelings of remorse, feelings of fear, feelings of shame, none of that can be addressed in a survey, because my gosh, you can barely put it together in your own head, right? Think of when you felt ashamed or embarrassed or fearful. Like, you can't put that into words on a survey. Not to mention, surveys are only as good as the questions asked. And what if, I don't know, what if you're using language that the people don't understand? What if you're literally using language like I've worked at schools that have 30 languages spoken in the same school. How the devil are you going to get everybody to fill out a survey and make all of those translations meaningful enough that people know exactly what's being said? So I want to just say, to my mind, the best use of surveys in community research is when people have a high level of trust within their group, and when people have a high level of shared meaning. So, for instance, let's say I am working with a health clinic and they want to find out what are the best ways that nurses can use to talk to people about sexually transmitted infections, let's just say. Now, nurses are going to be a group of people that have a lot of shared language, a lot of shared meaning. When you say a certain thing about, when you consult with a patient, they know exactly what that means. There's not ambiguity. And also, they tend to, because they are in the same profession, trust one another. They're not fearful to answer a survey. They trust one another. So that is an example where I would use a survey. I would say, yes, we're going to start with a survey of nurses and find out, how are they currently talking about sexually transmitted infections? What barriers are they seeing? What successes are they seeing? That is a reliable use of a survey. You can kind of see, though, if you wanted to find out about how sexually transmitted infections are discussed among teenagers or among teachers in school with teenagers, there might be less shared meaning, right? Like, one teenager might be thinking you're talking about, I don't know, something else that starts with STI, like they might not even know what that means. Or they might be embarrassed to talk about something like that on paper. They might be afraid their friend's going to snatch it away from them and look at their answers. They might be afraid to, I don't know, even hang out in the room where people are talking about sexually transmitted infections. So that's an example of, like, the same topic, but an audience where quantitative research would be appropriate and one where qualitative research would be appropriate. I hope that's helpful. Yeah, so we're talking about how qualitative and ethnography projects come about. I do just want to say, because you already mentioned we're already talking about surveys and such, because of this addiction to quantitative data that we have culturally, there is way less funding for ethnography than for any other kind of social research in America. And way less funding that would be from the government, definitely, but also even from organizations and foundations. And so a lot of times, qualitative component to research comes in, as it did in my work, because the researcher says, hey, if you want to know this, you have to do it this way. And so there's a quantitative component, and then there's also a qualitative component too, but not because they asked for it. because the researcher knows that it's going to be important. There's one more way that qualitative and ethnographic projects come to be, and that is through the individual researcher's interest. Now, the majority of the time, those projects come to fruition is because somebody is in a doctoral program and they get approval to study a certain thing for their dissertation. Because there is still, even though it's not much now, but there is still funding available for people's doctoral work in, often there is still funding. It's also possible that individual researchers have their own interests and embark on a research project on their own. And I have done that a couple of times in my life so far. Folks, we don't do that very often because it's coming out of my own pocket when I do that, right? But as a person who is interested in public scholarship and in making things, right? Like I'm interested in creative expressions of research. Sometimes we do that. So for instance, I did a project in the early 2000s that was looking at gender. And I feel like this would be such a different project today, and probably easier to do in some ways. But I was interested in interviewing people who use the women's bathroom in public places, but are mistaken for men. And even finding this group of people required that I be in places where they might be gathered, because that's where I put up flyers and that's where I put up, shared information for the fact that we were doing these interviews and focus groups. So, there was, I don't even know there. I guess there's at least one lesbian bar in San Diego, but there used to be a different one. I flyered and talked to people in that location. I talked to people in a variety of locations. And we did a number of, interviews. I'm saying I was the one facilitating, but then I also had someone helping transcribe those interviews. And I created a set of data out of which I wrote a stage play, right? So that's one expression of, creative use of ethnographic data. Yes, Wendy. Oh, I hear you talking, but
because I had to unmute myself. We have another question. This is from Lance Parker. Going back to the service providers, do you see organizations sourcing questions from the service users instead of assuming that the researchers know what variables are important to question on?
Yeah. Well, look, this is precisely the job of the qualitative researcher. Remember I talked about listen, talk, listen, write, that there's you're doing all three of those things throughout the entire process. So the listening process comes first. You don't assume you know what the questions are. That's why you're asking broad, open-ended questions to start. And then you can start to hone questions. But definitely, if you're going to use a survey tool, the questions should be developed in conjunction with the kinds of people who you want to answer the questions, so that you can know what kind of things to do. Now, to your point, do I see organizations sourcing questions? Sometimes without guidance, they are not, and they're just coming up with those questions on their own. And here's why. Because they also know something in a deep way about the job that they do. Think about any job you do. You think you already know stuff, don't you? And you do. You do know stuff. You don't know all the stuff, though. And so sometimes there has to be somebody like, the outside researcher that comes along and says, hey, if we wanted to just stick with what you already know, that might be easy, but it won't be useful. So we're going to have to do exactly what you have said there, Lance, and talk to the service users themselves. Is there anything else from the?
It looks like we might have a question from Rosa Solis. Thank you, Rosa. I'm a student and in the Promise program. Is there a question part of that statement, Rosa? Please feel free to put that in the chat. I thought of something while you were talking about the questions and the service providers, Kimberly. Oh, okay. Thank you, Rosa. I'm glad you're here. It's always good to have students. And in fact, I was thinking about students, how important as colleges are changing the way they look at things and the things they do, when it affects students, it's so important to have students in that planning process because they know the student culture and possible questions and ideas that could come up. You know, I don't know, you just suddenly drove home the importance of that because they are from the culture that is being studied. They're members of it. And I remember when you were doing the consulting, and I remember that you had, just as examples, you had someone that interpreted or spoke to people in Spanish, you know, to ask questions or get information. I seem to remember her interviewing people with AIDS. And you told me later that she was good, but her Spanish was a little stilted, like an English speaking person who learned Spanish at college. So she sounded, you know, not quite like the people that she was interviewing. And then you had someone who spoke Tagalog, who you said was actually perfect because she understood the culture really well and the hierarchies and how you speak to people, you know, various people within those hierarchies and relationships.
I'm glad you're mentioning this because let me just say something about this. You know, every researcher, like in ethnography, in qualitative research, the researcher, me, the human being, I am the instrument that I'm using to collect data, right? It's like there's no, like, it's not like if I can only get the you know, the recording device to work right, then it'll all be fine and we've recorded everything. No, I, the human being, am filtering all of this information. So there is no perfect instrument, right? There is no perfect human who's gonna talk and listen and write and come up with the data, right? It's not possible. But what is possible is that we always come back to the question of what are the strengths I bring and what are the weaknesses I bring? Because here's the thing, like, let's say I've got somebody who's got, you know, stilted language abilities, academic language abilities, doesn't know so much about the area, but let's say, using your example of because I don't remember this specifically, but using your example of talking about AIDS services, but that person is super comfortable talking about practices that might be risk factors or might be challenges, right? So maybe those kind of practices have to do with sex or drug use or life challenges like homelessness. So it's possible that person has fewer language skills, but more comfort talking about those topics. It's also possible that, on the other hand, I've got a native language speaker who is way better at the language, way better at understanding nuance, but really uncomfortable talking about some of the things that are coming up in the interviews. So it's not like either one of these people is bad and terrible idea and we throw them out. We just acknowledge what are the challenges here so that I work with that person who is not part of the culture about different ways to build rapport within that room. And I work with that other person to make sure that she is not leaving out data when she writes up the report because she's too uncomfortable to talk about certain things. She's too uncomfortable to say certain things. So in ethnography, there's no perfect instrument, right? So all of us, all the time, we have to be constantly self-reflective, and in the best scenario, reflecting on each other's work as well, right? This was something that was very important to me with Current Change Consulting was that we met regularly as a team to talk about the work that we were doing, so that hopefully we could help to identify some of each other's blind spots and some of each other's challenges in the work itself. Is that helpful?
Yes. Yes. Can you also talk about the needs assessment, what that's like on the ground? Like, if you can't do a survey and parents don't really want to talk, let's say using that example, right, about why they're not more engaged, how do you bring them together and get their ideas and opinions?
Yeah, so I can walk through that one because it's one that we did many times. The first thing that I would do is go to the school in the morning where kids are being dropped off. And for little kids in particular, often the parents literally bring them onto the campus and into the classroom, right? Sometimes they're just shoving them out the car door, but often they're coming in to to bring them. The first thing that I would do in that scenario is hang around and say hello to people and notice which teachers had the best rapport with parents, because usually there were some where where I would notice, oh, parents are stopping to talk to that teacher, whereas parents are just in and out with these other teachers. So go to those teachers and, first of all, talk to them, write some data about them, find out what's going on with them that is working, because here we've already identified a positive outlier. That's one way to talk about that, right? We've already identified, like, well, here's the problem, but wait, here's a moment where there is no problem. So what does that look like? We can identify and make some data about that. The next thing I'd do is show up in a fairly public place with some donuts and some coffee. And people like to get a donut and some coffee, right? And so you got some donut and some coffee, and then there's more chatting, more hanging out with people. And as I or my researchers would introduce ourselves, we'd say, yeah, it's really great to talk with you and nice to meet you. We're here helping the school try to understand how to get more people involved on the campus. Do you have any ideas about that? So this is not yet an interview. It is a casual interaction, and it's also an opportunity to observe not just what a person says, but their body language, their speed of departure, their engagement or lack thereof, and also to observe, like, especially in schools where there's a whole bunch of different languages being spoken, people travel in packs, right? Like, there will be the group of new Somali immigrants, and then there will be over here the group of Tagalog speakers that hang out and talk together, and over here there'll be somebody else. So that business of making sure that the coffee and the donuts are available to everyone is an important thing, and also to listen to and identify different groups, because it's possible you are not ever going to get the Spanish speakers and the Somali families together in the same place. You might, but that might be too much, right? So part of what you might be looking at is learning what are the natural contours of this population and how do they move in this space. And from there, we might actually invite people to a community meeting to share their views, and that one is going to include lunch. And I really, the food is incredibly important. It's like we like to make jokes about, oh, did you serve food? You can get people to come with food. It's not just about somebody being hungry. Food is a form of respect. Food is a form of connection. And, if I am working, I mean, everybody's going to eat some donuts, but if it's lunch, if it's a meal, if I am serving a meal to a group of Tagalog speakers, there's going to be some pancit and some, there's going to be some Filipino food in there. If I know that I'm working with a certain group of folks, there's going to be food they recognize. You don't, like you can't default to sandwiches. Like, you can't just go like, oh, everybody understand. No, that doesn't make people comfortable in the same way. Oh, here's another thing is that I try to get parents who, who don't seem very helpful. I try to engage them to help me figure out, okay, so what local place do you eat? Where should I get food for our lunch? Like, we're going to have lunch. Like, where do you eat lunch? What's your favorite place? Okay, what's your favorite thing on the menu? Like, I'm there with the highlighter and the menu trying to talk to people about what should we order? What should we have? And, these are like ways to communicate with people that are not about what do I need? Right? I mean, sure, I'm going to have this, I want to know what to order for lunch, but it's really just, we're having a conversation. We're not like in there going like, I gotta go. So quick, tell me what the barriers are to, the school talking to you. Because that's an important thing, right? Is that information comes at the pace it comes. And there are certain things we can do to move things along, but there's also time you got to wait. And this is the other reason why sometimes ethnography, in particular, and qualitative research in general, is not so well funded. It's because it takes longer. And then eventually we get some people to come to a focus group, we get some interviews, and then we get those people involved in implementing the strategies that they have discussed. The end. Well, never the end, right?
Since I teach writing, I'm kind of curious about how you get from the data that you've collected through interviews that, maybe has been transcribed, and your field notes, any field notes you might have taken, maybe even photographs, stuff like that. How do you move all of that stuff into writing? Because you've got like this big pile of diverse data, and maybe I'm imagining you have a guiding question, but what goes into that process?
So it's called coding. So the thing is, you take all of this stuff that's data, and then you have to go through and code it. And coding means you are going through and you are looking for themes. And these are themes that emerge from the data, not themes that emerge from your mind, right? So for instance, this is important because, sure, I'm going to look for the stuff that is, of course, because it's on my mind, right? Parent involvement is on my mind. So I'm going to look for that. But if I keep seeing something emerging about shoes, like, what the heck? Why is everybody talking about shoes? And, and then I find out that, I don't know, families, there are a lot of recent immigrant families have arrived without adequate clothing for their children. Is that data I throw away? No, just because we're focused on parent involvement. No, you want to know this thing about clothes and shoes, and you want to know whatever data has emerged in the data set. And so the coding is important. You go through and you get this big old bunch of themes, you put them into categories, and you mark in the data where you saw this theme. Now, we literally used to do this with paper and scissors. Now there's there's actually software that, helps you do coding. I've never used use that. I've definitely done it on computer most of my life, but not with the software. But so you go through and you have all these little pieces where that information lives in the data, and then you can move it around and you can talk about it, and you can go like, oh, right, here's a piece of data we have on inadequate clothing for children under 10. And, oh, here's this part we have on fear of being on the school grounds because the mom got in trouble often at school, or it wasn't a comfortable place for her to be, or she got smacked once for speaking her own language, or, I mean, there's real reasons why people don't want to be involved in schools. And so some of it's trauma. So you've got all this stuff in the data, and then you can pull it out, and that's when you can start to go, oh, Right. I've read about this trauma thing before. Let me see what I can find in the literature. This is where this turns into a real research report, is that you're pulling together what you have found in your data with what exists in the literature to explain certain things. And then you're writing the stuff that connects all the pieces together. And that writing process, yeah, it can include all of those little things, all those fragments, all those, all that stuff. Oftentimes, a research report would have like 4 appendices with it. And the appendices would be things like the quantitative data that the school keeps on how many people use the, I don't know, the free closet, or it might be the additional literature that we used, or it might be the photos that somebody took as part of their photo elicitation project. So yeah, you put in all that stuff in the appendices of your report.
Thank you for that.
Of course. I can't stress enough that, like, it's wonderful to me, even though my training is in sociology, that you are teaching about this in English, because you cannot be a good qualitative researcher without becoming a better writer, without putting your attention on becoming a better writer over time. Because this is that we are writing the data. And so, just like that thing about how there is no perfect instrument, there's no perfect person to collect the data, we want to be super aware of our strengths and our weaknesses and always push to improve our ability to write. Yes, Andrew.
Yeah, I just thought of a question since you're talking about sociology and because you're teaching sociology class right now. How do you think um, sociology relates to your work or comes back to your work with also like finding data or talking to people or talking about ethnographer stories? Because that's one of the reasons why I wanted to major in sociology, is because I really enjoy wanting to help people or talking with people or just learning more about people. So yeah.
Yes, a super good question. Look, sociology, of course, is, the study of human society or human culture. And there's other disciplines in academia that do that, right? Anthropology does that. Psychology does that in a different way. Communication studies does that. Because of our whole national addiction to numbers, sociology has long been more grounded in quantitative research than qualitative. So a whole lot of my colleagues, when I go to conferences, for instance, like the International Symposium on Qualitative Inquiry, there are definitely sociologists there, but there are way more communication studies people there, because that is, qualitative work is bigger in their field than quantitative work. So how does this relate in my mind? And like at a program like our master's program even the bachelor's program at CalState San Marcos, you have to take, as an undergrad, qualitative methods and quantitative methods. So when I was getting a sociology degree at University of Colorado, you didn't have to take qualitative methods. Like, that's how unimportant it was. Like, that's just a niche interest, right? It wasn't like this is a cornerstone of how we do social research. And a lot of campuses now are seeing qualitative work as a cornerstone of how we do social research. So it's really a great thing, right, that we're preparing our students to do both. But that connection with I think it is absolutely vital that sociological perspectives are engaged in qualitative research, and that qualitative research guides how sociologists think, because it has not always been so. Sociology started out really as, a bunch of old white men really trying hard to be like the hard sciences. We're going to be like this, we're going to be the scientists of society. And it screwed us up a little bit, you know. So now people are starting to understand more, like, right, right. First of all, there's not like objectivity in the way that they were thinking about it. But that there's more that we can do to understand culture and understand society than just poke it with a stick from afar, which is kind of what the big science surveys do. That's the moral of my story today. Don't poke it with a stick from afar. You know, get in there and talk to people and write about it.
Love it. We have a question from Anonymous. Well, maybe not a question, it's a thought. I wonder how many students in the past would have pursued sociology and other fields had qualitative research been more accepted and used in studies.
Yeah, I wonder that too. But now it is possible. Now it is possible. Definitely, though, the thing that I do with autoethnography is still very much part of communication studies. And there's just a handful of us in sociology that use this kind of work. But, you know, a handful is better than none. If we were interested in more on this topic, is there a website, TED Talk, or book you could recommend? Wendy, I bet you could recommend things. I can recommend, like, if you really want to know about the process of coding and, you know, writing coding data and what to do with it. There's a book called Writing Ethnographic Field Notes by Emerson, Fretz, and Shaw. I'm sure there's newer books, but that's the one that I used to teach from quite a bit. And yeah, I would say to look at ethnographies themselves, like look at books that use this kind of data. And ethnographies are a little bit harder to find than books that use interview data, right? But for instance, two books that use interview data that I like quite a bit, Peggy Orenstein's research on teenagers' views on sexuality. So one book is called Girls and Sex, and the other book is called Boys and Sex. I mean, simple titles, but those are great examples of qualitative research that includes an ethnographic component, and it still manages to be a rather broad study. And Wendy's giving you some
Remind
research.
me who the writer of Girls and Sex and Boys and Sex is.
Peggy Orenstein. She's written other books as well, but I've definitely used Girls and Sex in my youth and society class.
And Matthew Desmond wrote Eviction, and one of my students actually formed a little book club with her mom, and they read it together. They read the whole book. We didn't read the whole book for class, but she was really interested in it, and they said they related to it from their life experiences and found it really fascinating. It's really well written. And Matthew Desmond also just came out with a book called Poverty, and that's supposed to be very good as well. I was just showing Kimberly this one. This is Deep South by Allison Davis and some others. But my students and I read about this man who in, I think, the 30s, he was a Black man. He was an ethnographer. He went to the Deep South with his wife to study Black and white relations in, like Arkansas, I think he ended up in Natchez, Mississippi. And he also was accompanied by another white couple who kind of helped them, who would, act like maybe they were sort of assisting the white couple, when really I think it was mostly his ethnography. So the library had this book from 1940 something. I don't know if it was last checked out, but it still has a little card in it from 1968. But it's a little technical. He has a lot of charts and things like that, but it's so interesting to think about how brave he was to do that at the time when it was really dangerous. And he had to know the culture really well and the rules, like, can't go to the front door of a white person's house and knock on it, for example. So I think that one's really good.
You also can find in academic literature, right, with academic presses, there are ethnographies published that address certain topics, like Mary Robertson's book.
I was just going to say that one.
And
Okay, yeah,
what's it called?
Growing Up Queer.
Growing Up Queer. I'm also thinking of Tim, what is his last name?
Weiss?
No, the book is called Making Gray Gold, and it is about nursing homes. And he did participant observation, like literally worked as a nursing home aide while he was writing this ethnography. Talk about hard labor. Tim, somebody, it's going to come to me. But, these kind of books are with academic presses, but this is largely who publishes ethnographies, unless it is a story that can be made into something of broader interest, like the girls and sex and boys and sex studies.
And sometimes once you're attuned to this, you start seeing ethnographies in a lot of things. Like, I'll post it, but my students and I read about a girls' Timothy Diamond.
Thank you.
A girls' skateboarding group in Bolivia. And it's a photo essay, but you can tell that the writer went and interviewed the girls, went where they went, talked to their families, asked them what was important to them, and wrote this beautiful article. A lot of documentaries that we watch are ethnographic, that they might not count as a university professor's ethnography or something like that, but they are very good, and they tell you about people, and they're built on a lot of the same ideas: living with people, working with people, collecting data on the people, doing research on the people, the area, the history. There's a lot of really interesting stuff out there. Some of it's super accessible, others is a little academic, some's in between. Well, gosh, it's 3:59. Looks like
it's 3:59. And can I just take one moment to say, if you want to keep improving your writing, let me invite you to CalState Summer Arts. Summer Arts is an opportunity that the CalState University system offers. And there's writing classes and music and dance and theater and all of these various things. And I am teaching a summer arts course this summer on novel writing. And but you're invited to that every year, but certainly take a look this year at csusummerarts.org and come if you can.
Okay, it's in the chat. I think I got that right. csusummerarts.org. I've actually been to that twice, and I had a wonderful time. I took my stepson once, and he studied cinematography, and it was a total blast. There's just all kinds of art stuff going on there, and you're there for 2 weeks. So
2 weeks, and you earn 3 units of college credit. I mean, it's really great. Or you could stay for 4 weeks and earn 6 units, and that's kind of rad.
Yes, it's very rad and very fun. And there are scholarships available. So it's awesome. Well, thank you, Kimberly. This was amazing. Thank you for taking time out of your incredibly busy and full life to come and talk to us. Super instructive. Everyone, thank you for coming. Please fill out the survey. The link's in the chat. Hope everyone has a happy Wednesday. This is Choi Smith Productions signing off.